Well, hello again. Now, in this podcast, what I'm going to do is to talk about wildlife photography, and it's particularly aimed at somebody who is thinking about doing it but hasn't done it before. So it's really a case of looking at what you need to think about and what is different with wildlife photography when you start comparing it to other types of photography that you might have been doing. So before I get started, I just want to remind you to like and subscribe and also add comments. It's always good to get feedback, and that way I can carry on doing what I do and give you podcasts and information that's relevant to you. Now, the other thing I will say before I dive in is that there is now an ebook available. So it's only a few euros or whatever currency you care to pay in. You can download it. It's also available as a PDF, and it dives into a little more detail about getting into wildlife photography than I will in this podcast. So that's the ads over. So what do you need to think about? Well, there are some fundamental things. Now, I'm going to assume that by wildlife, we're talking about animals that you don't, first of all, get very close to. You might do, but on the whole, you're expecting to be working at a distance from your subject. Secondly, the thing to remember is that these are wild animals, so the chances are that they're going to do their thing, and it's up to you to go and find them. So this is not studio photography. Which also means you have to think about the equipment that you're using and also where you've got to take it. So let's just look at those few things first of all. So first of all, the distance thing. Now, if you are photographing an animal at distance, generally with the photographs, you want to get visually as close to the animal as you can. So that basically means that you're probably looking at a telephoto lens on the camera that you're using. Now, if you're using smartphone, there is a little trick that you can use, and that is to use binoculars if you have binoculars available. And you basically attach your smartphone camera lens to one of the eyepieces of the binocular. Now, you can get away with this, and I've seen people do it, in particularly people in wildlife parks where they are regularly seeing animals, and it's a great way of getting an optical zoom. And this is another thing, another differentiation that you need to remember. So if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about an optical zoom and a digital zoom, let me enlighten you. So basically an optical zoom is what is the zoom that you achieve through a lens. So it doesn't have to be a zoom lens, but if, for example, you go from looking at an animal or anything for that matter through something like a 50mm lens, which is on 35mm systems or full frame digital, that would give you a normal view, as in the same magnification that you would see with your own eyes. That would be a 50mm lens to give you that normal view. And that's why you might see a 50mm lens referred to as a normal lens. As you go to crop sensors, it changes. So it depends on the format that you're using. But for 35mm and full frame digital, that's what a normal lens is. So basically, as the focal length gets longer, so basically the number gets bigger than 50. So it could be 100mm, it could be 200mm, it could be 400. Each of those gives you an increase in magnification. So it's like looking through a telescope, but a longer telescope each time. So hopefully that's making sense. And that is an optical zoom. So you're doing all of the zooming is being done optically. Digital zoom is different, and it's where you take a photograph on a digital camera, and I'm just going to keep it to digital cameras because it just keeps things simple. You put that file on your computer, and then using an editor, so it could be Photoshop or Lightroom or something else, you basically zoom in on the screen. So what you are doing in its simplest form is you're pulling the pixels that make up that picture, you're pulling them apart. So you're basically pulling them away from one another. So the important difference here is that you are not adding detail. when you use an optical zoom, as you zoom in optically, you are adding detail to what goes on to the raw file that you are recording in the camera. So if you're using a zoom lens, so I use a 100 to 400 normally. So as I zoom from a 100mm focal length to 400, the detail that I record on the file in my camera, as I move from 100 to 400, that detail gets greater. When you go to digital zoom, you are not adding detail. Now, you can get algorithms that will kind of guess at what should be in the missing pixels, and it will fill them in. Some are better than others, but that's the basic difference between digital zoom and optical zoom. So I perhaps labored that a little bit, but I think it's an important thing to understand. So this is why if you zoom in digitally, you can get pictures that basically that picture will not look very sharp. That's what it comes down to. So that's the first thing. So the chances are that you will want to use a telephoto lens. And that then means that the camera that you're using needs to be able to accept a longer lens. So if you're using a camera with a built-in lens, that might be a limitation straight away. But make sure any zoom that you do, the more zoom you can do optically, the better. So you can get these little compact cameras or bridge cameras that do include a zoom, and just have a look at them. As always, if you're buying new gear, always try it out if you can, just to see what the results are like. But my recommendation is definitely that you look at either a mirrorless camera with exchangeable lenses or a DSLR. And basically, SLR single lens reflex, what makes camera single lens reflex is that you can exchange the lenses. Now, some will probably get really pedantic on me and tell me it's not quite that, but in practical terms, that's what it is. So DSLRs have exchangeable lenses, and a lot of mirrorless cameras will have exchangeable lenses. And that's really what you want, because that gives you a lot of flexibility in what you're able to shoot. Of course, that also means that you might be looking at carrying multiple lenses to where you're doing your photography. So that's another thing to consider. How are you going to get to where your subject is going to be? And often that might mean going in a boat. So where I was photographing humpback whales, I'd often be out at sea in a boat. So with things like whales, actually, you can sometimes shoot them from the shore, because if they're coming close to the shore, then fair enough, you don't have to go out in a boat. But most whales are not close to shore. They're further offshore. And to get a good picture of them, you need to close that distance down. So you need to be in a boat. So think about how you're going to get to see the animal. If it's a land animal, if it's a tiger, for example, or a lion or an elephant or anything like that, you probably are going to be in a four-wheel drive of some sort, and you'll be driving. So where you're being driven to where you're going to do the photography, and if you're being driven or if you're in a boat, the chances are you're going to stay in the four-wheel drive or stay in the boat. So that does mean that you need to be able to use the gear you're using in that environment. Now, if it's a small open four-wheel drive, that probably works quite well. If it's one of these large bus things that they have in some parks, that might not be quite so good, because you might be fighting to get a view. And this is always a problem with if you're going on one of these tourist buses, they can be quite frustrating. So where you can, I do recommend that you think about the vehicle and try and get something that gives you easy access to the windows, or some of these that have a roof that lifts off or up so that you can stand up and shoot from there. I generally recommend, if you're looking at standing up, I would try and get down low, because I think you get much better, a much more intimate portrait or photograph, let's say, with an animal where you're at the same eye level. And particularly if you've got an animal that's lying in the grass. So, for example, again, it could be a predator, it could be a lion or a tiger or something like that. The lower you get, the closer you are to being at eye level with the animal, and I think you get a much more impactful image. So this is something to think about when it comes to composition. and how you're going to photograph that animal when you get the chance. If you are in a vehicle, the things that you need to think about there are how much gear are you taking. So that will determine whether you're using a simple backpack or you've got a much larger, maybe a camera backpack to carry stuff. And can you get access to it? Because you obviously need to be able to get access to it. And if you're fighting for space, that can be difficult. So if you are in an environment where you don't have a lot of room, then I recommend that you really take just one camera with a zoom lens and don't worry about extra stuff. I mean, in your pocket, you could have a microfiber cloth or something like that just to clean the lens, maybe some lens cleaning fluid, a small blow brush, something like that. But keep it really simple. Keep it simple, and that way you can access things and you're likely to get better results. Where you're in a smaller vehicle, again, if you've got the room, it's good to have a backup body. I like to take two camera bodies, one with a wide angle lens on, one with the telephoto zoom that I mentioned. The reason for having the wide angle is it's nice to take what I refer as more of a context type shot. And what I mean by that is that you show the animal, but in more of a wide angle setting. So people who aren't familiar with the animal can see where it lives and the kind of environment you're shooting it in. And there might be other things of interest as well. Also, it gives you some artistic options when it comes to coming up with photographs. Now, I've spoken about having a backup body to do that, but equally, most of us are carrying around smartphones. And I've already mentioned using a smartphone in combination with binoculars, because they will give you, honestly, a binocular lens is pretty good generally, and probably better than any of these add-on lenses that you can buy for smartphones. I'm sure some people, again, will argue with me about that. And if you've got those clip-on lenses, then by all means have a go, because you've got nothing to lose, and they're a lot cheaper than buying a big telephoto, set up for a DSLR or a mirrorless. But of course, the other way you can use the smartphone is for wide angle, and you don't need anything for that. And of course, they're very easy to carry around. They're relatively small, light, and you don't need a lot of room to shoot with them. So don't neglect anything you normally carry with you. Regard it as another resource and make full use of it. I like smartphones for a couple of reasons. One is I can do a full panoramic shot. So a panorama, if you're not familiar, is where you just set it to pano mode and you kind of pivot. So, and the tip there is to hold it in portrait. So you're holding the smartphone vertically, not horizontally, and then just set it to pano mode, hit the button or whatever you've got to do on your camera to get that going, and then just pivot around and try and keep steady, try and keep level, but shoot what you can on that. And again, it gives you creative options. So you can come back with a variety of shots, hopefully some reasonably tight close-ups of the animal, but also some photos of it in its natural environment. And you can have a bit of fun with that as well. And the other thing I use the smartphone for is to shoot video, because it's always good to have video. Video is very engaging. I like photographs. That's my natural habitat as a photographer. But I do shoot a bit of video as well. I don't use it that often, or not so much in the work I normally produce, but I might use them for webinars or for workshops, things like that. And they're quite useful for behind the scenes things as well, if you want to go down that path. So another key thing to remember when you go to shooting wildlife photography is, yes, it is different. There are things you've got to think about, but don't neglect what you already have, because there is definitely a possibility, and I can't tell you how big it is, but it's definitely there, that you can make use of equipment you already have and you might initially have discounted because it's not a long telephoto lens, which is what most people think about when you think about wildlife. Now, the other thing to think about with the gear that you're carrying is that other option I mentioned, where you might have to walk to where the wildlife is. So here you've got to think about how far you've got to walk, what the terrain is likely to be, and what the weather conditions are, because walking for 3 hours in the foothills of mountains where it's a very rainy environment, which is what I've done when I was photographing gorillas, that is definitely something you need to think about. So you're going to think about the backpack you're carrying. So I definitely recommend something with hip straps because that puts the weight of what you're carrying. Most of it goes onto your hips and not on your shoulders, which means it goes onto your back if it's on your shoulders. And if you've got any kind of a back problem, you will definitely know about it after 3 hours of walking. I can guarantee you that, because camera gear can be quite heavy. Plus you're likely to be carrying other things. It might be snacks, it might be water, but there will be other things there that you have to carry. And carrying water's quite heavy. You know, a litre of water is a kilo, so you can't discount that. So think about everything you've got to carry, and that might also include a raincoat if you're somewhere where it could get very, very wet very quickly, which was again the case in southwest Uganda where I was photographing gorillas. Equally, you might be somewhere where it's very hot. And I've last year did a big hike in Namibia. It was over 100 Ks, and that I have to say was pretty tough. And I did a lot of walking locally, so I definitely walked 200-300 Ks in total to get myself fit enough to walk. But unfortunately, I was mostly on roads. It's quite hilly where I live at the moment, so I was getting that kind of practice in, and I was definitely wearing in my walking boots. That's another thing. If you are wearing walking boots, do make sure that you have worn them in, and do that before you go, because when you're there with the animals, you don't want to be worrying about walking your boots in, because the chances are you might get a bit of blistering, that sort of thing initially, and that's going to distract you when you're trying to focus on photographing animals. So yeah, really have a think about where you are. And if it is very hot, for example, you definitely need to be carrying water. You might have a camel backpack, which is what I had in Namibia. So a camel backpack is basically, it's got a bladder in it and usually a tube, a drinks tube that you clip somewhere where you can reach it very easily while you're walking. And you might have 2 litres of water in there. So there's a couple of kilos straight away before you even start. So with wildlife, yes, the photography part is important, but the environment is just as important, because you may need to get yourself fit, and don't underestimate that if you're doing some walking. It is important to be fit, because again, you can't really enjoy it, and it's harder to focus on photographs if you're in pain. And I've got to say, I had a back issue before I went to Uganda, and we did a 3-hour hike to find the gorillas, and I would have paid really good money to have 10 minutes in an armchair before we actually spent time with the gorillas. And as it was, because I was crouching and we were having to step over branches and things and be very aware of where the gorillas were and what they were doing, because I did have a young male run at me and I had to do the appropriate things there. That is harder when you're in pain from your back, and I was, to be honest. So it was a lot more of an effort and a much less enjoyable experience, let's say, than I was hoping for when I set the trip up. So the next thing to think about are technical skills, and this is where I can't emphasize enough that you know your camera before you go. So you really have to know the exposure triangle. So you do not want to be shooting in auto, put it that way. And if you're going to come out of auto, you've got to know how the exposure triangle works, because it's really important to get the exposure correct. You need to have a well-exposed photograph. It needs to be in focus. But once you know how to use the exposure triangle, you can start working with depth of field, which gives you some... It's not only creative flexibility, but it means that you can create photographs that have a lot of impact. So this is really important to understand the exposure triangle. It's really important that you understand how your camera works, how your autofocus works, how your metering works. And if you don't know those things, then find out. It's as simple as that. A lot of these things are actually fairly straightforward, but you just need to know how to do them. And the chances are you won't need to change them that often. So with exposure triangle, definitely you want to be working in one of the modes. I generally use aperture priority, but you need to know how all that works. If you don't, so find out. Either YouTube it, go on a course. If you're really new to photography, I would definitely recommend going on a course. The course I have for DSLR and mirrorless takes you from no knowledge at all to being able to produce creative images. I share most of what I know in that course. But if my style of teaching doesn't work for you, that's fine. Find somebody else. But do get familiar with that. And then practice as much as you can. Now, again, I don't know where you are. You might be lucky. You might live relatively close to where there's wildlife. You might have wildlife where you live. So if that's the case, then you can just practice when you get the opportunity. But if you don't have wildlife nearby, or this is a really big trip that you're setting up, then photograph birds, because we pretty much all have access to birds one way or another. And they certainly photographing birds in flight can be a bit tricky. And it will definitely highlight shortcomings that you have in your own technical ability with the camera. So that's setting focus, setting depth of field, getting good sharp images. And even when they're in trees, you then have to deal with things in the foreground and the background that might throw off the autofocus. And these are important skills to have, because when you're with a wild animal, now let's say you're photographing tigers, for example, you've gone to one of the tiger parks, and tigers will generally they'll generally use cover to get to their prey animals. So they're hunters. So they're not going to be drawing a lot of attention to themselves. There isn't going to be a brass band with them. So they're going to be it's likely that they'll be in long grass. So the chances are for at least some of the encounters you have, if you're lucky enough to have encounters, you're going to have to shoot them, photograph them through long grass. Or maybe there's undergrowth of some sort in the way. So you really need to know how to get the exposure correct and how to get the autofocus. And I'm going to assume you're using autofocus, but get that focused where you want it and not where the camera thinks suddenly it needs to focus. Because that can be so frustrating to go to all that trouble. And then at the end of it, not have a single photograph that is sharp, that is well exposed, that is something that you can really feel you've achieved something when you're photographing the animals. So technical skills are important. And the point about understanding the exposure, how your camera works with exposure, is important, because you could well be in an environment, so it could be forest. And if you're in forest on a sunny day, the chances are the canopy doesn't completely stop the sunlight, direct sunlight coming through, which means you're likely to have areas that are quite bright, where they're well lit, but directly lit by sunlight, and areas that are quite dark because they're in shade. So you've got to be able to handle those kind of environments. You've got to be able to handle the lighting when there's a storm going through, and you might need to shoot in that sort of situation. So do be aware of that. On the plus side, there's probably a good chance that you'll be able to take advantage of the golden hour and also blue hour. So if you don't know what they are, golden hour is that hour immediately after the sunrise, so when the sun is above the horizon. And also, so there's another one, the hour immediately before the sun disappears below the horizon. So basically the golden hours are when the sun is low in the horizon and you get that beautiful golden color. And often you'll find predators particularly are active in those hours. And if you're really lucky, you can get some beautifully lit shots of the wildlife that you are looking for. Obviously, it doesn't have to be predators, but any animal. And then the blue hour is the complementary hour, if you like. So it's the hour immediately after sunset. So when the sun disappears below the horizon, and the hour immediately before dawn. So the sun is below the horizon, but in both circumstances, you're getting more and more light happening. But so again, you get this really cool lighting, and take advantage of it, because these could be the shots that define your whole trip and your whole experience. So that's the technical side. Now, there are some other things that you need to think about. So first of all is keeping safe. I'm a big believer. I mean, I love to go and photograph in great locations, but also I'm a big believer in staying safe, because you need to. So you need to respect the environment you're in, particularly if you're not used to, if you don't live in that sort of environment. Let's say it's very hot or very cold, or whatever it is. So take advice from people who guide you. And I absolutely recommend you get a local guide, a reputable company or guide to help you. Now, these people are great because they can make a big difference in the final experience you have in your trip. Generally, they will know what to do. So in the circumstance I mentioned with the young gorilla running at me, I knew what to do because we'd had a briefing about it, and that kept me safe. Now, it was an interesting experience, I grant you, and because a young gorilla is still at least as big as I am and a lot more powerful. So I didn't want to annoy him. So I just followed the drill. So local people will give you a drill. They'll tell you how to behave. If you're in a four-wheel drive, the golden rule is don't stick arms and legs out because it can make things curious, and you really don't want them to be very curious about you. That's it's sort of a general tip. So use the guide. They will give you the local guidance. They're also very good at tracking generally. They'll know how to find the animals. So obviously tracks on the ground are one way that you find animals, but there are many others. So anything that's left behind by an animal is known as spoor. So that could be animal tracks, could be dung, it could be broken vegetation. Anything like that is known, at least in Africa, as spoor. So they'll definitely be looking for that. But in India, one of the ways we found tigers was to listen for alarm calls. So the different animals, so deer, for example, Barasinger, have a particular alarm call that's a bit like a bark. So again, the guides will know what they're listening for, because when you hear an alarm call, that you know that there's a predator there, if that's what you're looking for. So that tells you that, the animals are kind of working for you in one way when they're mostly working for themselves because they don't want to be eaten. But, but local guides will be tuned into all of this stuff. So this is where they're really valuable. So do think about safety, do use local guides because they know how to find animals. And there's also the ethical considerations, and respect the environment you're in for your own safety, but also to respect the animals. And I have seen in some of these larger parks, which are very commercial, and you'll have an animal, and it actually happened when I was in Etosha, at least to some extent. It's not as bad as I've seen worse, but you'll have one animal. There was a lion, male lion, lying under a tree, middle of the afternoon, very hot, and it was just trying to sleep, and there were at least 20 vehicles around it. It's just crazy. And what I have seen that I absolutely don't like is where a driver will just drive at the animal to try and provoke a response so that the customers have something to photograph. That's not what it is about. This is about ethical tourism, and ethical tourism is respecting local people. It's respecting the local environment, leave only footprints, take only photographs. And it's definitely respecting the animals, not stressing them. Hopefully the reason that you are there to photograph animals in the first place is because you enjoy them and you want to see them continue to be around. And unfortunately, many of the iconic animals are threatened or close to extinction. The actual biomass of a lot of these animals are like if you think of wild animals, the biomass, the mammal biomass, as in, putting all of the body parts together, if you like, of all mammals on the planet, it's something like 5 to 10, but it's less than 10%. That's wild animals. Most of it is us, chickens, things like that. The animals that we like to eat, but just be aware of that. So these animals are rare. So you really, treat them well. And then you'll also get a lot of enjoyment from your encounters with them. So I think the other thing to be aware of as well, the other big difference when you go from other types of photography is just to be patient. To be patient and to be ready, because you don't know when something's going to happen. And with wild animals, it can happen pretty quickly. So do be aware. One of the things, certainly when I was doing humpback whale photography, was I would always turn off the auto power down on the camera, because sometimes I could be watching a whale for 20 minutes with absolutely nothing happening. It might just swim a little bit and all I'm seeing is a dorsal fin. and then out of the blue it will breach. Now, breach happens really quickly. It's less than a couple of seconds. So you have to be ready to go. You have to be on that animal and shooting as you're even pivoting on it. What you don't want is to wait a couple of seconds for the camera to turn itself back on again because you'll get if you're lucky, you'll get a picture of the splash, but that's probably it. So do think about things like that. Think about the environment you're in. If you're photographing animals that pretty much just stay put or move very slowly, then it doesn't really matter. But if you're in an environment where hunting is going on, and the chances are it's not going to happen very often where you are, so you really have to be ready to go because it might be the only time in that trip that you have that opportunity. So always be ready to go. And another thing not to do when you're taking photographs is to do what's known as chimping, which is to take a few photographs and then start looking at them on the back of the camera, because you can pretty much put money on the fact that while you're doing that, the animal's going to do something really interesting, and you're going to miss it because you're looking at the back of your camera. And when you get the camera up again to take a photograph, it will stop, and that's that. So these are the kind of things to think about. I haven't said much about composition, but really normal composition rules apply. So have a think about the kind of compositions you want to shoot, that you may or may not get the opportunity. Again, it's quite opportunistic, but it's always good to have some ideas sort of just in the back of your mind that you can switch on to if you get the opportunity. So do a bit of research, have a look at wildlife photographers whose work you like. If it's me, there's stuff on my website. You can always look at that. If somebody else, that's great. There are a lot of really good wildlife photographers out there. So have a look on Instagram and places like that. Do a hashtag wildlife or hashtag tigers or hashtag whatever animal you're interested in, and see what photographs are there. Look at the photographers, go have a look at their work, because you'll get ideas about composition, lighting, mood, all that sort of thing. And it's really good to do that before you go so that you've got some ideas. Equally, though, you have to remember that you might come away with none of those things, but you might come away with something different. So always be willing to try new things. And as I've said, just practice as much as you can. Shoot birds, shoot other animals, ideally wild animals, because you've got that time pressure usually to do something. So and it's good to get into that discipline of composing and shooting very quickly. So if you're somebody who likes to take your time over composition, you really need to break that habit and get a lot faster. So I do thoroughly recommend that you practice a lot to get very good at setting up your composition and then shooting. Okay, and honestly, for the bulk of it, I would say that is it. In terms of what accessories to take with you, probably not much, and possibly not things you would think about. So, for example, tripods. They're good if you're doing bird photography where you've got a hide or somewhere where you can just set up and shoot. But for most other types, I would say probably not. Definitely if you're shooting from a vehicle, you probably won't want a tripod if you're shooting stills. If you're on a boat, good luck with that, because I saw somebody try and shoot whales from a tripod once and it was quite hilarious. You're not going to get good results. So the thing is to practice working with the camera setup you have. If you need to even, bulk up a bit, get a bit stronger, because some of these systems can be quite heavy, and maybe you need to actually do a little bit of a workout every now and again, just build your strength up so that you're comfortable carrying the camera, comfortable holding it, and you're pretty steady when you're pushing your shutter down. So, and I'm not really joking about that. If you can just get a bit stronger physically, if your gear is a bit heavier, that will definitely help you, because if you rely on a support like a tripod or a monopod, you might find you come a little bit unstuck, because you sometimes have to move quite quickly, and you can't do that on those things in most circumstances. If you're in a four-wheel drive, what I do recommend you do is work out a pad of some sort. So what I mean by that is maybe fold up a t-shirt and put it on the side of the vehicle and rest your camera lens on the pad. And the reason for doing that is usually they will keep the engine running. particularly if it's something like an elephant, because elephants and hippos or rhinos, things that are quite bulky and can charge you. Cape buffalo are another one. So the chances are they can keep the engine running. And if you are resting your camera lens against the side of the vehicle, the chances are you're going to get vibration from the engine coming through. So anything you can do to dampen that out is a bonus. Also, remember, if you're in a four-wheel drive and you're shooting, always use a fast shutter speed, because people move around. They're going to move around while they're just to get a better position for themselves. Their consideration of other photographers generally goes out of the window pretty fast. So just assume that people are going to bounce around, be a bit of a nuisance, and not help you with your shots. So just get good at composing and shooting really quickly. So again, I recommend high shutter speeds, probably in the order of thousandths of a second. Even if you're shooting an animal that isn't moving very much, because the chances are something else will be moving, and it might be another passenger. So so be ready for that. Okay, so as I've said, there is an ebook where these tips and more are there. So you're welcome to just invest in that, and hopefully that will help you to get great results. But having said all of that, photographing wildlife, it definitely has its drawbacks. But when you get great photographs, it's just one of those things that sort of make all the preparation worthwhile, for sure. And maybe discomfort if you've had to hike a long way and you've got a blister or a bad back or whatever it is. But just looking back on those photographs, if you get some good ones, it makes that all worthwhile. So I do absolutely recommend it. So that's it for this podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe. Please take a look at my website. There's information there to help you with your own photography. I've got the courses as well. So, and the occasional workshops. So please take a look, see what's on. There are various downloads as well. So take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.